everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We talk a lot about research here, about how we learn about the world, but I think it's easy to skim over one super important detail.
Yeah, definitely.
How researchers actually choose who they study in the first place, their participants.
Right, like who gets to be a part of shaping those big discoveries and conclusions.
Exactly. So today we are going to take a look at that process with a real-world lens. It's going to be a deep dive into two specific ways researchers pick participants: convenience sampling and purposive sampling.
Good stuff.
We're going to be drawing our insights from this really interesting article called Comparison of Convenience Sampling and Purposive Sampling. It was published in the American Journal of Theoretical and Applied Statistics back in 2016.
Yeah.
And I think what's cool about this topic is that it's not just for scientists or academics. It's for anyone who wants to be a more critical thinker about the information they come across every day.
Absolutely. Whether you're, reading a news article, trying to understand a market research report, or even just curious about how your favorite products are developed.
Yeah, or a new medical treatment.
Exactly. Knowing how researchers chose their sample, that small group they study, can really help you understand the strengths and limitations of what they're telling you.
Absolutely. It's like looking under the hood, so to speak, to really get a sense of how the engine works.
Right, exactly.
So let's start with a quick overview. Imagine you're trying to learn something about a large group of people, your population. Could be anything: smartphone users in a city, people with a certain health condition, you name it.
Right.
It's usually impossible to study every single person in that group.
Way too much, yeah.
So researchers grab a smaller group, their sample, to represent the whole.
And it's how they pick that sample that really matters.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's crucial. Our source article lays out this fundamental distinction between probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling, that's like your classic random lottery draw. Everyone in that big group theoretically has a known chance of being picked.
Okay, so it's like drawing names out of a hat, making sure everyone has an equal shot.
Exactly. And that's your gold standard when you want to be really confident that your sample accurately reflects the entire population. But for this deep dive, we're focusing on non-probability sampling. This is where things get a bit more, let's say, strategic or even just practical sometimes.
Right.
The article points out that sometimes doing the whole random lottery thing just isn't feasible.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Like, imagine trying to get a random sample of people from a huge geographic area. The logistics could be a nightmare. Or maybe the research question itself is very specific and doesn't really need that broad random representation.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's jump into our first method: convenience sampling. And I've got to say, the name is pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, it is. It's about grabbing the low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
Right, the participants who are easy to reach, readily available, not a lot of hassle. In fact, the article even uses these other terms like haphazard or accidental sampling to kind of emphasize that it's about who's right there in front of you.
And it's really common, more than you might think.
Yeah.
I mean, the article brings up some great examples from ecology and biology.
Okay.
Like, think about an ecologist studying plants or animals in a certain area. If they're just recording what they happen to see along the trails they're already walking on, that's a convenience sample. Or a biologist collecting data near their campsite, that's convenience too.
It's like, this is what's here, I'm going to study it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's practical, but it might not tell the whole story. Like, what about all the species that are deeper in the forest, away from those easy-to-access areas?
So you're saying it might not be completely representative of the whole ecosystem.
Right. And the article's benchmark problem for convenience sampling really hits this home. It talks about a psychologist in Nigeria wanting to study the impact of social networks like Facebook or Instagram on university students' study habits.
Sure.
The easiest thing for this psychologist to do is to just survey students at their own university. Makes sense from a practical standpoint.
Oh, for sure. It's convenient. It saves time. It saves money.
Definitely. But, and this is the key question for anyone consuming research, are the students at that university really representative of all university students in Nigeria?
That's a good point.
Like, maybe students at different universities have different access to technology, different cultural norms around social media use, all sorts of things that could affect how those platforms influence their study habits.
So what seems convenient for the researcher might not give us a complete or accurate picture of the bigger issue.
Right, exactly. So while convenience sampling has its advantages, and the article definitely acknowledges those.
Okay, like what?
Well, it's generally affordable. pretty simple to carry out, and researchers can often get their sample pretty quickly because it's just, readily available.
Right, you're not spending months trying to track people down.
Exactly. But, and this is where things get really interesting, the article really emphasizes that convenience samples are very, very likely to be biased.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, because you're not selecting participants randomly, certain groups who are easier to reach might end up being way overrepresented in that sample.
I see.
And other groups might be underrepresented or maybe even completely missed altogether. You just don't know how well your convenient little group actually mirrors the bigger population you're trying to understand.
Right. Like if you're doing a study on exercise habits and you just ask people at your local gym, you're probably going to get a very different picture than if you randomly surveyed people all over town.
Exactly. And this can lead to what the article calls hidden biases.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means there might be some underlying characteristic that your convenient participants share that you haven't even considered, but it's influencing your results.
Oh, interesting.
And the article also flags outliers, those unusual cases that don't fit the typical pattern. In a convenience sample where you haven't really aimed for a broad representation, those outliers can really skew your findings, make them less reliable.
Okay, so it's like you're missing part of the puzzle, potentially a big part.
Right. And because of that, the article makes it clear, if researchers choose convenience sampling, they've really got to be upfront about how their sample might be different from a truly representative one. They have to tell us who they might be missing and acknowledge the limitations of their study. In fact, some researchers even argue that convenience sampling just isn't appropriate for certain types of research, especially in the social sciences, because those limitations are so significant.
I see. It's about being honest about what the research can and can't tell us.
Exactly. So with convenience sampling, you're essentially assuming that the big group you're studying is pretty homogeneous, like that taking a sample from a nearby convenient source will give you similar results to a sample drawn randomly from the entire population. And in reality, people are diverse. They have different experiences, different backgrounds, different opinions.
It's about recognizing that people are individuals, not just data points.
Absolutely. And the last thing the article notes about convenience sampling is that while you can technically use it for both quantitative studies, which are more number-focused, and qualitative studies, which focus more on experiences and perspectives, it tends to be more common in quantitative research.
Okay. Why do you think that is?
Well, with convenience sampling, it's often easier to get a larger sample size just because of that ease of access. And in quantitative research, having lots of data points can sometimes create the illusion of strong findings, even if there's underlying bias, because of how the sample was chosen.
So we need to be extra cautious when looking at studies based on convenience samples.
Exactly. Think critically about who those participants might be and how that might influence the results.
Okay, so we've unpacked convenience sampling. Now, let's move on to our second method, purposive sampling. And again, the name kind of gives it away.
Yeah, this one's all about intentionality. The researcher is going in with a very specific purpose in mind when they choose their participants.
Right, it's not about who's closest or easiest to reach.
It's about finding the people who have specific knowledge or experiences that are directly relevant to the research question. Like, they might be experts in a field, they might have lived through a particular event, or they might have a certain skill set that's being studied.
So it's really targeted. The researcher's saying, I need to hear from people who can provide unique insights because of who they are or what they've been through.
Right. And the article points out that beyond just knowledge and experience, a participant's willingness to share openly, their availability, and even their ability to articulate their thoughts clearly become key factors in deciding who to include.
So it's not just what they know, but how they can communicate that knowledge.
Exactly. And purposive sampling is most often used in qualitative research.
Okay.
Think about studies that involve in-depth interviews, focus groups, or analyzing personal stories and experiences. These methods are all about digging deep into those subjective, nuanced perspectives, rather than just counting occurrences or measuring things.
Right. It's about understanding the why behind people's actions or beliefs.
Exactly. And the benchmark problem for purposive sampling in our article paints a really clear picture of how this works in practice.
Okay.
So imagine a data analyst wants to understand the experiences of pregnant women in Kano State, Nigeria, but specifically those who are attending their second antenatal care visit in October 2015.
Wow, that's very specific.
It is. And the researcher, with their very clear purpose, doesn't just go to any clinic and talk to any pregnant woman. They make a deliberate effort to identify clinics offering antenatal care, and then they specifically focus on women who are at that exact point in their pregnancy.
So they're screening out women who are at their first visit or their third or any other stage. It's very intentional.
Absolutely. And what I found really helpful in the article is that it then breaks down all these different types of purposive sampling, which are basically strategic approaches for choosing the right participants based on what you're trying to learn.
Okay, so walk me through some of those.
Let's start with maximum variation sampling.
Okay.
Sometimes it's called heterogeneous sampling.
Okay.
And this is where you're intentionally seeking out a wide range of viewpoints, a broad spectrum of perspectives. It's not about getting a statistically representative sample.
Got it.
It's more about capturing as many facets of an issue as possible, especially if you're working with a smaller sample size overall.
So, like, if you were studying people's experiences with online learning, you wouldn't just want to talk to students who loved it. You'd want to include folks who hated it, people who felt neutral, folks who excelled, and people who struggled, the whole spectrum.
Exactly. And by doing that, you get a much richer, more complete understanding of how online learning is perceived and experienced.
Okay, that makes sense. What about some other types?
Well, there's homogeneous sampling, which is almost the opposite. Here, you're focusing on participants who share certain characteristics. So you're looking for commonalities rather than differences. Like the article gives the example of researching the long-term health impacts of exposure to asbestos in a particular workplace. With homogeneous sampling, you might only include people who worked in that specific environment and were exposed to asbestos for a certain number of years.
So everyone in your sample has that shared experience.
Right. And by focusing in on that shared experience, you might be able to identify patterns or health outcomes that are specific to that group.
Okay, I see how that could be useful.
Then there's something called typical case sampling, which is all about finding the most average or typical experience.
Okay, so in a way, it's kind of the opposite of looking for the extremes.
Exactly. It's about establishing a baseline. Like, imagine you're studying the effectiveness of a new career guidance program for ninth grade students. With typical case sampling, you might choose schools from similar socioeconomic backgrounds to get a sense of the standard reaction or the most common outcomes.
So it's like taking the temperature of the average experience.
Exactly. Then, on the flip side, you have extreme or deviant case sampling, where you do focus on those outliers, the unusual cases.
Right, the people who have had really positive or really negative experiences far from the norm.
Right. Like, let's say you're studying the recovery process after a certain type of surgery. With extreme case sampling, you might focus on patients who recovered much faster or much slower than average.
Okay, why would you do that?
Well, by examining those extremes, you might be able to get clues about what factors contribute to those exceptional outcomes, whether positive or negative. He can help you identify best practices or potential red flags.
So it's about learning from those who are furthest from the average.
Precisely. Then there's critical case sampling, which sounds really interesting.
Yeah, tell me more about that one.
With critical case sampling, you're choosing a few very important cases, sometimes just one or two, to see if a phenomenon even exists or if a problem is more widespread than you initially thought.
Oh, I see. It's like saying, if we see this happening in this very specific important situation, is it likely to be happening elsewhere too?
Right. It's often used in early stages of research when you have limited resources and you're trying to decide whether a more in-depth investigation is warranted.
Makes sense. It's like a pilot study to see if there's something worth digging deeper into.
Exactly. Then you have total population sampling, which is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that sounds like you're studying every single individual within a very specific group.
Right. So instead of taking a sample, you're including everyone who meets your criteria. And the article points out that this is usually only feasible when the total number of eligible people is pretty small, like if you were studying people with a rare skill or a rare condition.
Right, because in that case, excluding anyone might mean you miss out on crucial information.
Exactly. And then the final type of purposive sampling the article discusses is expert sampling.
Okay, so this is where you're going straight to the people who are recognized as authorities in a particular field.
Exactly. It's a great strategy when you're dealing with a new or complex topic where there isn't much existing research, or when you need the deep knowledge of those who've dedicated their careers to studying that area.
So you're tapping into their years of experience and expertise to gain a more nuanced understanding.
Right. It's really helpful for long-term research planning or to assess if a particular research avenue is even promising.
Okay, so that was quite a rundown of all the different types of purposive sampling.
Yeah, it really highlights how strategic and intentional this method can be. But one crucial concept to keep in mind with purposive sampling is saturation.
Okay, what's saturation?
It means that researchers keep seeking out participants until they reach a point where they're not hearing any new or significantly different information. So the sample size isn't determined by some statistical formula. It's determined by how deep they've been able to go in understanding the phenomenon they're studying.
So it's not about quantity, it's about quality and richness of information.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so now that we've looked at both convenience sampling and purposive sampling in detail, let's step back and think about how they compare.
Yeah, what are the key differences and similarities we need to be aware of?
Well, the most obvious similarity, as the article points out, is that they both fall under the umbrella of non-random sampling. This means that the researcher's judgment and decisions about who to include play a big role. And that introduces the possibility of bias, which limits how much we can generalize the findings to the larger population.
So while they have different strengths, they also share that limitation.
Right. But their typical applications are quite different. Convenience sampling, while it can be used in both quantitative and qualitative studies, tends to be more common in quantitative research. That's where you're often dealing with larger sample sizes and focusing on numerical data.
And purposive sampling.
Purposive sampling, on the other hand, is much more closely aligned with qualitative research, where the focus is on getting those rich, in-depth insights from participants' experiences and perspectives. In fact, the article even states that purposive sampling isn't really suitable when you're dealing with purely quantitative variables, things that can be easily measured with numbers.
Okay, so they kind of have their own areas of strength.
Exactly. And their core objectives are different too. Convenience sampling, even though it doesn't always achieve it, often aims for some degree of generalizability. It's trying to say, what we've learned from this convenient sample might tell us something about the larger group, whereas purposive sampling is much more focused on gaining that really deep understanding of a very specific group, even if that means you can't then make sweeping statements about the entire population.
So it's a trade-off between breadth and depth.
Right. And finally, the way sample size is determined varies quite a bit. With convenience sampling, researchers might increase the number of participants just to boost the statistical power of their findings, especially in quantitative studies.
Okay.
But with purposive sampling, it's all about reaching that saturation point we talked about, where you're not getting any new substantial information.
So quantity isn't the driver there, it's about the richness of the data.
Exactly.
So to sum up our deep dive today, we've seen how convenience sampling can be a quick, easy, and affordable way for researchers to collect data.
Yeah.
But it comes with those big caveats about potential bias and limited generalizability.
Right. Purposive sampling, on the other hand, is more about making very deliberate choices about who to include to get really rich, in-depth information, especially in qualitative research. But it comes with its own limitations, mainly related to researcher subjectivity and, again, the ability to generalize those findings to the broader population.
So ultimately, deciding which method to use really depends on what the researcher is trying to learn, what resources they have, and whether their priority is getting a broad overview or a very specific, in-depth understanding.
Absolutely.
And for our listeners, next time you come across some interesting research findings, whether it's in a news article, a report for work, or even just something you see online, take a moment to think about how those researchers chose their participants. Was it just a matter of convenience, or was there a specific reason why those particular individuals were included?
That's such a good point.
Because understanding the sampling method used can really help you evaluate how much weight to give those findings, how broadly they might apply, and whether there might be some underlying bias that you need to be aware of.
It's like having that extra layer of critical thinking skills to navigate the world of information.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. We've talked about how both convenience and purposive sampling have these inherent limitations when it comes to generalizability. So how can researchers, and really all of us who consume research, be more thoughtful and transparent about the scope and potential biases of these findings? How do we make sure that valuable insights aren't dismissed simply because the sample wasn't perfectly representative, while at the same time avoiding the temptation to overstate the applicability of those findings? It's definitely something to consider as we all try to make sense of the increasingly complex world around us.
So much good stuff to think about.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. See you next time.